Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Minuteman National Historical Park. My name is Park Ranger Jim Hollister, and today I am joined by my colleague,
Jarrad Fuoss, also Park Ranger here at Minuteman National Historical Park.
And today we are going to be talking about the musket. So this musket is a Flintlock musket. Now, this particular one is a replica of a British military musket known as the King's Arm, also sometimes known as Brown Bess. It was the standard weapon in the British Army and also saw some service with the Massachusetts militia at the beginning of the war. Now, when I say it is a flintlock musket, what I mean is that it is fired by means of a sharpened piece of flint striking against a hardened piece of steel. And when they strike together, that creates sparks. Those sparks would fall down into the flash pan, which contains a small amount of gunpowder called the priming charge. When the sparks hit the priming charge, it flashes or explodes, and the flames from that small explosion get drawn through a hole in the side of the barrel called the vent or touch hole, and that ignites a much larger amount of gunpowder inside the barrel. And when that explodes, it creates a lot of pressure in this little confined space, and that is what propels the ball out. Now, when I say a musket, what I'm talking about is a smooth bore weapon. So that means the area inside the barrel is smooth, like a drain pipe. And the ball that you load with is smaller than the diameter of the bore. So this particular bore is 0.75 inches or 75 caliber, and you would load it with a ball that was 68 caliber. What you're doing is you're trading accuracy for speed. You could probably get more accuracy out of a weapon like this with a tighter fitting ball. However, in combat, speed counts. So a trained soldier could load and fire this weapon 3 times in a minute. That means you have to have this weapon ready to fire within 20 seconds. Now, of course, you load it through the muzzle. That's why you have a loose-fitting ball. You put in your powder, your ball, a bit of paper on top, draw your ramrod, ram it home, just as easy as that. After priming, and then you're ready to fire. So again, within 20 seconds. Now, when you do fire that shot, the bullet comes rattling out, leaves the muzzle at about 700 miles an hour, wobbling like a knuckleball. You could kill somebody at 300 yards. Problem is, you really have no chance of hitting them deliberately, maybe by accident. Most battles were fought within 100 yards. The way these weapons were used in combat and the way soldiers were trained was to stand in lines, shoulder to shoulder, front rank, center rank, rear rank, letting the enemy get within 100 yards, and then they would start firing what's called volley fire. So you'd have your whole company of 50 men fire, or 2 companies together called a grand division firing. And you're alternating your fire all along the line, sending pockets of concentrated fire downfield every couple of seconds, smashing into the ranks of the oncoming enemy. So when you think about using the weapon like that in concert with other soldiers, firing together, somebody's bound to hit something, and this weapon is particularly deadly. Now, along the battle road here on April 19th of 1775, that didn't happen very much. The British Army was moving down the road very quickly, and Minutemen were running through these fields, firing at individual targets. So they kept the fire going all day long and constantly bringing in reinforcements. It was the right thing to do for the situation, but that's not how the musket is properly used. And we figure probably about 1 hit for every 300 shots. Think about the Battle of Bunker Hill less than 2 months later. The famous quote, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." We have a lot of the same people like John Hartwell, who lived here at the Hartwell Tavern at Bunker Hill. And what that means, they're letting the enemy get close and they're firing at close range together. That's how the weapon is supposed to be used, and both sides certainly were well trained in those tactics.
All right, now that we've heard a little bit from Ranger Jim about how these muskets worked, now it's the time to talk about how they were used on the field and how the soldiers knew how to use them. One of the myths of the American Revolution, of the battles of Lexington and Concord specifically, are that the militia soldiers that are out here fighting on April 19, 1775 were untrained. They were men that just stepped out from the farm fields, from their plows, and went off to fight the British Army. Couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, almost all of the soldiers, the militia soldiers, the regulars, everyone that's out here has been trained extensively throughout the course of their lives in the use of these weapons, particularly in a specifically set drill manual. And the reason that they need to know how to use these weapons in a specific type of way, why they're using drill manuals, is first of all because they need to be effective on the battlefield. Like Ranger Jim said, these soldiers, these militiamen, are lining up shoulder to shoulder, many soldiers down either direction, and they have to be able to operate in a small amount of space. So if you can imagine, while you're loading and firing one of these muskets, it might be easy to throw elbows out there, to move your musket around. That would be problematic on the battlefield, not just because you'd be hitting soldiers next to you, but because it would also slow down your rate of fire. As we talked about, a well-trained soldier could fire up to 3 shots in a minute with one of these muskets, and it is a long, lengthy process that they had to perfect through hours and hours of drill. Each of the soldiers would have learned different ways to hold their muskets, different ways to handle the guns while they're standing in those ranks. Not only this, they would have also learned how to march. That way, as they're moving across open sections of ground, or even if they're moving through trees or over fences or farm fields, they know how to keep that unit cohesion together so that they are more effective warriors on the field itself. Now, one of the other things to consider with one of these muskets per se is the length of the musket. When we see these, we often think, wow, that is a long gun, almost up to my shoulder height. The reason for that being is because when militia soldiers and regulars fought in battles, they were often not just lined up shoulder to shoulder, but in ranks deep, which meant you would have had another soldier standing directly behind you. By law, these militiamen here on April 19th were required to have a weapon that was over 3.5 feet in length at the barrel. The reason being is because when they're aiming the musket, they need that barrel to go over the shoulder of the person standing in front of them. You don't want a short barrel because then you'll have the gun going off right in their face, but you also don't want to be able to snap the flint right in the side of their head as well. So you want their head directly in between, right in the sweet spot where they're not going to be injured by your own soldiers while you're in the field. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about how the musket is used on the battlefield, next we have to talk about the other side of that story. What happens when you are firing one of these muskets at an enemy downrange? What I have in my hand right here, if you can see it, is a musket ball that is the equivalent size of what would have been used here on April 19, 1775 by both sides, militia and regulars. This is a soft lead musket ball. And the thing about this is that these are incredibly devastating to the human body on the field. We have countless accounts of what happened to the wounded that were left strewn along the battle road here in the vicinity of the Hartwell Tavern where we're standing at after the day's fighting. And the thing to consider with these soft lead musket balls is that they're soft, which means when it strikes something, they have a tendency to flatten out. As an example of what can be done, the damage done by one of these balls, you can see we have our Board of Education here that has some holes in it in the front. You can see the size of the musket ball entering the side of the board. The problem, though, being is that once it goes inside the board, it's going to flatten out. It's going to start bouncing around. These aren't high-powered weapons like we have today. These are low-velocity guns, which means when they come out the other side, they are devastating. You can see the size of the damage done by just one of these musket balls passing through this board here, and you can imagine what that would do to the human body. We have countless accounts of soldiers along the battle road that are wounded during the course of the fighting. One such occurrence takes place on the other side of the battle road at a place called Fisk Hill. There at the base of the hill lived a woman named Rebecca Fisk. On the evening of April 19, 1775, Rebecca comes back to her home after the fighting has concluded to find 3 horribly wounded soldiers lying in her front parlor. She talks about those soldiers wallowing in a puddle of their own blood caused by the devastating effect of one of these musket balls. One of those soldiers had even had his jaw taken away by one of those balls. He was very fortunate, though, because he lived from his wound. One of Rebecca Fisk's in-laws, a doctor from the area, would actually come to that house after the fighting, traversing up and down the battle road, taking care of the wounded soldiers that they came across. In Rebecca Fisk's house, the doctor came to dress the wounds of the king's soldiers left there, talking about extracting musket balls from the wounds of those men. However, a number of them did not survive. They perished and were thus later buried along the Battle Road Trail. And these are scenes that repeat themselves over and over and over again. For many of the soldiers, they're wounded here on April 19, 1775. This is just the beginning of a lifelong battle that they were faced, caused by this small piece of lead fired out the barrel of a gun here one day in April. All right, so now we're actually going to go through the process of loading and firing one of these muskets according to the 1764 manual exercise.
Prepare to prime and load. Handle cartridge. Prime. Shut pan. Cast about. Charge with cartridge. Draw rammer. Ram down cartridge. Return rammer. Shoulder firelocks. Make ready. Present. Fire. Half cock firelock. Shoulder firelock. Shut pan. As you can imagine, in battle, giving each one of those commands would be time-consuming and cumbersome. In a combat situation, the officers would simply yell, "Prime and load," or the order would be given by a drum signal, and the soldiers would do so on their own. Once they've finished loading, they come back to this position, the shoulder, and that signals the officer that the men are loaded and ready to receive the commands to fire. And then he would give them the commands and then yell, "Prime and load," and they would do it all over again. Jarrad and I are right now going to demonstrate for you how they would handle these weapons in a combat situation. I'm going to yell prime and load, and Jarrad's going to load on his own, and then I'll give him the firing commands. Again, the goal was 3 shots in a minute. We're going to do the best we can. However, we're not going to hurry because safety first. Make ready. Present. Fire. Prime and load. Make ready. Present. Fire. Prime and load. Make ready. Present. Fire. Half cock firelock. Shoulder firelock. Secure firelock. Shoulder firelock. Shut pan. You may have noticed as Jarrad was firing repeatedly, the smoke that would build up. That's from one gun. So imagine a regiment in battle, 500 muskets being loaded and fired as quickly as the soldiers can. The smoke would very quickly obscure the battlefield, which also cuts down on the range at which you could damage your enemy, because beyond 100 yards, you may not be sure who's out there because you have a very difficult time seeing them and identifying them properly. And another thing that happens as you continue to fire, your flint gets worn out. It becomes dull. It's not going to produce the spark that you need. So it's going to reduce the reliability of the weapon. And also, not all the powder goes off. a lot of it stays behind as this thick, oily sludge called fouling. And that's going to get all over the lock and inside the barrel, which is also going to decrease reliability. And it's going to slow you down because the balls are going to get harder to push down the barrel because of all that fouling constricting the bore. So there are a lot of factors. In addition, the men are getting tired. Imagine constantly repeating, going through this manual of loading and firing time after time after time. The soldiers are going to get tired. Now, there's another limiting factor which we will demonstrate for you now. Make ready. Present. Fire. Prime and load. Half cock, fire lock. Shoulder, fire lock. Secure, fire lock. Shoulder, fire lock. Shut, hand. So one of the limiting factors as you're continuing to fire is that you have a small explosion going on inside this barrel. It's going to heat up. So for example, Jarrad, how does that barrel feel right now?
It is incredibly hot, to the point that I can't even touch the barrel. It becomes difficult to grip the musket when I'm actually trying to load it. And I think we had taken the temperature of this once before, and it had been upwards of 113 plus degrees just after a few shots out of one of these muskets.
So as you can see, using the musket in battle required teamwork, training, and trust. Now, the Minutemen would have known each other in civilian life, and they would have built those relationships over many years. And on April 19th of 1775, those relationships were put to the ultimate test on that day and throughout the long conflict that ensued. So that's all we have for you today, and as always, thank you for watching.